So one of my favorite saints happens to be St. Patrick, in part because I love the holiday. I have no Irish blood in me, but when I was in high school, I lied about that. Because on St. Patrick's Day, I always wore one of those stickers that said, "Kiss me, I'm Irish." Unfortunately, it never worked. And then I went to college, and that stupid sticker still didn't work. But one of my professors began writing a book on the saints as models for the Christian life, and he invited me to research St. Patrick. I was quickly brought into this fascinating story of this saint who lived nearly 1,600 years ago, which was pretty great, because up until then, I was pretty resentful towards Patrick because I didn't have the luck of the Irish. But Patrick wrote an autobiography, but much of what we know about him comes from legend. But there might be some truth behind those stories. Patrick was born in the year 387 in Britain. His grandfather and his father were both Christians who were rich, upper-class members of their society. Young Patrick had very little interest in God, but he had a lot of interest in his family's wealth. In his autobiography, he describes his childhood life as spoiled and rebellious, and he lived a life of luxury. But when Patrick was 17, his life changed forever when Irish raiders attacked his parents' home and kidnapped him. The raiders took him back to Ireland and sold him into slavery to a tribal chief who forced Patrick to do the dirty, difficult, back-breaking work of tending his sheep. Patrick had no friends and no one to talk with, except his often cruel slave master. In a foreign land and a foreign language he only gradually began to understand, young Patrick battled depression and doubt and intense anger that stayed with him throughout his life. But Patrick wrote that it was in this moment of suffering and despair that he began to turn to God. Alone and in slavery, despite his pain, or maybe precisely because of it, Patrick opened himself to the loving presence of God. And after 6 years of slavery, he had a vision of God telling him that it was time for him to escape his slave master's home and return to his home in Britain. And so Patrick walked 200 miles from his slaveholder's home to the coast of Ireland, where he found a ship of reluctant pirates and convinced them to take him back to Britain. After months of traveling, Patrick finally made it back to his parents' house, and they were overjoyed to see their son. They expected him to continue the family tradition of living a life of privilege and comfort and wealth. But Patrick had another vision. Just after telling Patrick to escape Ireland and return home, God now told Patrick that he must once again leave his life of privilege behind and go back to Ireland. He must go back to the place that enslaved him, the place that caused him so much pain and trauma, but this time not as a slave, but to spread the message of Christianity to the Irish. Now, if I were Patrick, I would say, no way. Those jerks stole 6 years of my life and caused me so much pain. I am not going back there. But I think this is one important lesson from Patrick's life. You see, we often think that if you are doing the spiritual life right, everything will go well for you. God will bless you with all kinds of riches and joy, Today, we call this the prosperity gospel. But that kind of spirituality is false. The spiritual life sent the Israelites into the difficulties of the desert for 40 years. It sent Jesus into the desert for 40 days that we call Lent. And it sent Patrick back to the place that he didn't want to go. The spiritual life is not always easy. It often takes us out of our comfort zones. But like Patrick, if we keep our eyes on God, it can help us realize that there's something bigger than any resentment, than any fear, than any anger, than any desire for comfort that we may have. And that something bigger is sharing God's love with others. Patrick returned to Ireland, where legend says he did two extraordinary things. First, he helped convert the Irish from Druidism to Christianity. And second, he banished all the snakes from Ireland. Now, we may ask about this first one, what was so wrong with Druidism, right? There is some debate about this, but the Encyclopedia Britannica claims that the Druid priests offered human sacrifices for those who were gravely sick, in danger of death in battle, in hopes that the gods would heal them. There's evidence that they built massive wooden structures and forced large amounts of people in them, and then they burned the people alive in a sacrificial ritual. And so Patrick went back to Ireland to end such practices. The true God doesn't want sacrifice, but wants us to end sacrificing ourselves and others. As the prophet Hosea wrote, God doesn't demand sacrifice. God demands mercy. God demands mercy. And so Patrick went to Ireland to end the ways of sacrifice. So in a sense, one can say that Patrick banished Druid religion from Ireland, which leads us to the second claim, that Patrick banished all of the snakes from Ireland. Legend says he was fasting and praying on top of a hill when a plague of snakes came and attacked him. He then drove the snakes down the hill, banishing all of the snakes from Ireland. It's a weird story, right? Interestingly, we know that the story of the plague of snakes is a myth, because snakes haven't been on Ireland since the glacial age, nearly 1,500 years ago. Some explain the snake story by saying that the Irish wanted an explanation for why snakes aren't on the island. So they made up the story of Patrick banishing the snakes. Makes sense. But I think there's something else going on here. The modern anthropologist René Girard says that the ancient people often talked about plagues, such as snakes or diseases, metaphorically. Sometimes there really was a brood of snakes or a disease that plagued the ancient peoples, but often the plague that they spoke about was a metaphor for a different kind of plague, the plague of human violence. So when the ancients talked about Patrick banishing snakes from the island, there's evidence that they may have been talking metaphorically about Patrick banishing the violent practice of human sacrifice. Once I came across this idea, it helped me understand some other strange stories, including strange stories in the Bible, like we had today that Heather read for us from the book of Numbers. Like Patrick, the Israelites left their lives in slavery behind because God gave them a new vision of freedom. So under the leadership of Moses, they left Egypt and traveled for an exhausting 40 years into the desert towards the promised land. But again, the spiritual life is not always easy. It was difficult in the desert. There was little water and almost no food. The Israelites were tired and hungry and thirsty as the hot desert sun beat down upon them. How do people find a sense of meaning in such difficult times? I think there are two basic ways. One way is to complain and find someone to blame for our circumstances and our misery. And that's what the Israelites did. They united as they complained against Moses and God for taking them out of Egypt and into the struggles of the desert. And as I researched this passage this last week, I came across some interpretations that shamed the Israelites, saying, "Here they go again, those grumbling Israelites, complaining against God." This anti-Judaic sentiment continues with us for some reason, and I think that this sentiment needs to be banished like a bunch of snakes. The Israelites didn't complain because they were particularly disobedient Israelites. They complained because they were human. Any group that experiences these inner conflicts and social crises like the Israelites did, any group like this often acts like a brood of venomous snakes, attacking one another until a sense of solidarity can be formed by uniting our venom against a common enemy, a scapegoat. And that's what happened to the Israelites. Except, if you were listening, you may have noticed that they told the story a little differently. They claimed that God responded to their complaints by sending snakes to attack and kill many of the Israelites. But once the Israelites apologized, well, then God told Moses, "Hey, it's okay. Just make a bronze snake, put it up on a pole, and raise it up, and any Israelite who looks upon it will be saved from the snake bite." Which leads to many questions. Why didn't God just send the snakes away, right? The snakes stayed and continued to bite them, and then just look on this bronze pole. Just send the snakes away. But the God character in this story seems to have condemned many of the Israelites to the venom of snakes and only later saved them. But I have a problem with the literal interpretation of this story because, you see, I don't think God acts that way. I don't think that God is in the business of condemning anyone. That's not because I'm predisposed to making God into my own nice, comfortable image. No, personally, I would rather have a God that was in the condemning business so that I could get God on my side and condemn my enemies. But according to Jesus, God doesn't condemn anyone. In our passage today from the Gospel of John, Jesus refers to the story of Moses lifting up the bronze snake that heals everyone who looks at it. But did you notice that Jesus left out the whole part about God sending the snakes in the first place? This is what Jesus does when he refers to Old Testament stories of God's violence. He'll leave out God's violence part and just talk about God healing part. That's how Jesus interpreted God. God is the one who heals, not the God who harms. And this, I think, is where we find the second way to find meaning during difficult times. Because for Jesus, there is no condemnation. There is no violence within God. That's what the famous passage, "For God so loved the world that he sent his only Son," means. In Greek, the word for world is cosmos. It embraces all people, yes, but it also embraces all of creation. And like our passage also claims, God didn't send Jesus into the world to violently condemn it, but to save it through the love of Jesus. But what did Jesus come to save us from? Jesus came to save us from plaguing one another with the venom of physical, emotional, and spiritual violence. Jesus didn't come to save us from God's condemnation because there is no condemnation within God. He came to save us from a cycle of condemning one another. When Jesus says those who do not believe in the Son of God are already condemned, he's saying that we are the ones who condemn ourselves to cycles of hatred and violence. Like Patrick went to Ireland to banish the venomous practice of human sacrifice, and like Moses lifted up the bronze snake to save the Israelites from biting one another, Jesus was lifted up to the cross to reveal God's cosmic love, not God's cosmic condemnation. And here's the clincher for me. If there were any time that God would send a plague of venomous snakes in response to people complaining against God, it would be on the cross, this place where Jesus was crucified. But Jesus went to the cross not to appease the wrath or justice of God. Rather, Jesus went to the cross because people were acting like a brood of venomous snakes. And how did God respond? Jesus prayed for his persecutors, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Jesus came to change the way we think about God and the way we relate to one another. As we heard a few weeks ago, Jesus reveals that God is love, and God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all. But some want to claim that there's a tension within God of light and darkness, of love and hate, mercy and wrath. But I say that if God is tense, then God needs to see a therapist. There is no tension within God. The tension is within us. We are the ones who sometimes act like snakes. And here's the thing I've come to find that's so important for my spiritual development. It's always easy for me to see how others are acting like venomous snakes. But it's much more difficult for me to see how the venomous snakes exist inside of me too. And that's the potential problem with the story of St. Patrick and the story of the Israelites. It can too easily lead us to label those Druids as snakes because they practiced human sacrifice, or those Israelites as snakes because they complained so much. If I accuse the Israelites or the Druids, it can easily begin to lead me off the hook by seeing the snakes in everyone else except for myself. And there may be good reason to call out others who act like snakes. But I think the journey of Lent calls us to come face to face with our inner snakes. Because once we deal with our inner snakes, we can more authentically and more sympathetically call out the snakes that exist within others. And even more important, only when we acknowledge our inner snakes can we realize that God loves us. Truly loves us unconditionally, exactly as we are, even with our inner snakes. And so, yes, there are times something else is going on in these stories that might be just as important, I think. There are times when we need to call out others and ourselves for snake-like behavior. But if that's our focus, I think we might get distracted. After all, God tells Moses to have the Israelites look up at the bronze snake. Jesus says that he's like the bronze snake that's lifted up on the cross. So where we look matters. When we look up to Jesus, we stop looking at one another. Our primary motivation isn't complaining or being against someone else. Rather, when we look to Jesus, our primary motivation is to participate in the realm of God's love that is manifesting here on earth. So as we continue our Lenten journey, may we face down our inner snakes. May we realize that even when our inner snakes act up, God continues to love us and invites us to start again. And may we keep our eyes on Jesus, who was lifted up to reveal God's love that embraces each of us, and indeed, the entire cosmos. Amen. Hi, everyone. This is Adam Erickson, reminding you that no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome at Clackamas United Church of Christ. We are located at 15303 Southeast Webster Road in Milwaukie, Oregon. Our worship service starts at 10:30 on Sundays, except for during the summer months we start at 10 o'clock. If you'd like more information on our church, you can visit our Facebook page or our website at c-ucc.org. You can also reach out to me through email at adam@c-ucc.org. Until next time, grace and peace be with you.